I'll start this project by opening the synth rack, which is Sonar's home base for managing soft synths. I'll click the synth rack tab to bring it in focus. Then I'll click the insert icon to show the soft synth menu, which happens to be a custom menu which I've designed to show soft synths by type. Simple instrument tracks are great for soft synths which only have a stereo output like Rapture or Dimension Pro. But for a multi-out synth like Session Drummer 3, I'm going to choose all synth audio out stereo plus a MIDI source track, and I'll organize those inside of a track folder. Now all of Session Drummer 3's tracks are loaded and ready to go. Next, I'll fit these new tracks to my project by hitting F on my QWERTY keyboard, which is a favorite keyboard shortcut of mine. Next, I'm going to set up proper gain staging for Session Drummer 3. It may not seem like it, but it's actually super important because you don't want to overload the inputs for any plugins you might put on those tracks. To do this, I'm going to want to group all my tracks, so I'll click the Quick Group button in the top left corner of my track folder to put all of its tracks in a group. Now all I've got to do is turn down input trim on one track, and they all turn down at the same time. And one more click on that folder's Quick Group button, and now the tracks are ungrouped. Now I'm going to break down for you the interface of Session Drummer 3. It's made up of two main pages, the drum kit page, which you can see now, and the mixer page, which we're going to talk about in just a little bit. My favorite part of the drum kit page is, well, the drum kit. You can see it's modeled after a real drum kit. It's even got an electronic kit piece in the corner, as well as a realistic carpet, hardwood floor, and acoustic padding on the wall. To the bottom right of our drum kit is Session Drummer 3's pattern bank. It's made up of 8 patterns, A through H, with a transport, so you can play back patterns right from the synth. To the left of the pattern bank are the program browsers. From here I can launch the main program browser to load kits, or I can load MIDI patterns or individual kit pieces. Now I think it's time to demo some drum kits for you, so I'll click on New Program to launch the program browser. Session Drummer 3 ships with a lot of drum kits, including those by Smart Loops, Sonic Reality, and Steven Slate Drums. We've also made some of our own drum kits and added that to the pile. And we've included a bunch of rhythm machine kits which we sampled from the real classic instruments back at Roland's headquarters in Hamamatsu, Japan. You can bet these samples sound super tight. But we're going to focus on acoustic drums for this demo, so let's check out some of the Steven Slate kits first. In case you don't know, Steven Slate is a maniac when it comes to multi-sampled drum kits. He models them after drum kits from famous recordings by famous musicians, and we've got one of my favorites right here in Session Drummer 3, the Old Zepp kit. If you need a big, fat, larger-than-life acoustic kit, then this is it. Another dope kit from Steven Slate Drums is the Sizzle kit. Not quite as big, but packing more punch, this kit is sure to please those who are into hard rock and heavy metal. And being close to 500 megs in size, both Steven Slate kits have a lot of velocity layers. That's a great start to Session Drummer's library, and the Sonic Reality kits don't disappoint either. First, I'll play for you the Ring Beats kit, which weighs in at around 200 megs of samples and is of course made to sound like the kit of a certain famous British drummer. Nothing like that vintage British rock drum sound. Next, I'll load up the Gretsch kit and give that a whirl. This kit also uses about 200 megs of samples. Finally, I'm going to load up the Motown kit, which I'll be working on for the rest of the project. This kit is nice and punchy and has sort of a dry studio tone to it. There's something about the tone of the Motown kit that I just absolutely love. But before I get into writing a track with the Motown kit, I want to show you guys Session Drummer's mixer page. At the top of the page are velocity-sensitive preview pads. I can click low on the drum to hear a soft hit, or high on the drum to hear a loud hit. That's pretty cool. Below the preview pads are the width controls. And you guessed it, I can control the stereo width of my kit piece. Check out how the snare becomes narrow and goes back to sounding wide. Below the width controls are the tuning controls. And I can retune and detune each kit piece by any number of semitones I want, up to and including 24, which is 2 octaves for those of you keeping score at home. Below the tune knobs are the solo and mute buttons. And of course there are the pan controls and volume controls. So remember earlier in the video when I loaded up all those audio tracks for Session Drummer? Now I'm going to route each kit piece to its own virtual output so that they're on separate tracks in Sonar. To show you what I'm talking about, check out how when I play my drum kit, everything goes through one audio track. Now I'll show you how to do the routing. You can click on the triangle next to that number 1 to bring up the drop-down menu and click on a number to choose any of the 12 available outputs. Or, in case one way of doing things isn't enough, you can left-click or right-click on the number itself to cycle through the available outputs one at a time. So I think I'll leave my kick on output 1. I'm going to route my snare to output 2, my hi-hat to 3. I like to group my toms to 4, but you can route them individually. And I'll group my cymbals to 5, but you could certainly route those individually too. And because there's no percussion in this demo, I'll just leave those at 1 and I won't have to worry about them. So now when I play my drum kit, each piece will be on its own audio track in Sonar. Check it out. So that was kind of a lot of work to do all that actually. Thankfully, Sonar has a really cool feature which will allow us to save this and recall it at any time. And that feature, my friends, is called a track template, which is basically like a preset for a track, including those that are routed to soft synths. So I'm going to right-click in one of my tracks, choose Save as Track Template, open my Session Drummer 3 track template folder, type in a name for the template. I think I'll call it Motown Kit Multi-Out. And I'll click Save, and there it is. All the routing, including the drum kit and soft synth, are saved. Now, if I want to recall that at any time, I can right-click in any track, choose Insert from Track Template, scroll through the menu system, and there it is. There's the kit we just saved. Now I'll show you guys how I like to set up and arrange tracks in a project. First, I'll drag my MIDI track to the top, and I'm going to multi-select all of the unused audio tracks by clicking and dragging down on the number, right-clicking and choosing Delete Track. And I'll hit F on my QWERTY keyboard again to fit the remaining tracks to the screen. I'm also going to set up each track with its own unique track icon. I'll start with my kick drum track by right-clicking in its default icon and choosing Load Track Icon. Sonar ships with hundreds of icons in all different categories, or you can load your own pictures too. For my kick drum, I'll open up the drums folder and load a kick icon. Now I'll give my snare track a new icon. Up next is the hi-hat. And the tom-toms. And last but certainly not least, the cymbals. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to watch paint dry, but I am going to go ahead and name my tracks. Those of you who mix your drum tracks through a drum bus, please raise your hand. For those of you who still have your arm at your side, pay attention, because mixing drums through a drum bus is a fundamental and important part of mixing drums. And here's how you do it in Sonar. First, I'm going to go down to the bus pane at the bottom of the screen. I'll collapse the master bus, right-click just below it, and choose to insert a stereo bus. Okay, no more typing, I promise. But I am going to load another track icon. The next thing I need to do is route all of my drum tracks to the drum bus, and I can do this in one fell swoop. by multi-selecting those tracks, again by clicking and dragging down on the track numbers. Now I'll click on the output of one of the tracks. It can be any of the tracks because they're multi-selected, so I'll open the hi-hats drop-down menu and choose Selected Track Outputs. From the pop-up window, I'll select the Audio Outputs tab and choose the drum bus as my source. When I click OK, all of my drum tracks will be routed to the drum bus simultaneously. Now Session Drummer 3 is all set up with multiple outputs, a drum bus, and the track view's all neat and tidy with track names and track icons. So I'm ready to start creating some patterns and mixing them down, but before I do, I want to show you some patterns that come with Session Drummer 3, as well as Sonar's ability to manage and play them back. As you can hear, I've got some grooves going through the Motown kit, playing back in Session Drummer 3's pattern bank. So let's say you find a pattern in Session Drummer that you like and you want to use it in the project. Put your mouse over the drag and drop icon, click, hold, and drag it right into the track view. And because these patterns are groove clips, aka loops, you can slip edit the end of them and roll them out to repeat them as many times as you want. It's so easy. And you can double click the pattern to open it up in the piano roll view for traditional MIDI editing. Or for more advanced editing, you can open up the patterns in the step sequencer, which I'll show you in just a second. But first I'm going to show you Sonar's media browser, which is located in a tab at the bottom of the screen. The media browser is basically a window into your system's file structure. You can locate and preview many types of files, including audio files, MIDI files, even audio from video files. You can preview one-shots and loops, and even have the loops play back at the project tempo. The media browser has a nice little feature called Content Location Presets, which are basically shortcuts to your files. All of the loops and patterns that come with Sonar already have content location presets built into the media browser, including a location for all of the Session Drummer 3 loops, including those by Smart Loops, Steven Slate, and the Groove Monkey loops. The Groove Monkey loops come in many different styles like blues, country, funk, hip-hop, metal, and rock, so I'm going to browse through some of the rock loops. To preview a loop, turn on Auto Preview, choose the synth you want to preview it through, and then click the file. Let's say I want to use this pattern in my project. All I have to do is drag and drop it onto my MIDI track. Now I can roll it out and repeat it as many times as I want. And like I showed you before, I can double-click the pattern to open up the piano roll view for traditional MIDI editing, or for more advanced editing, I can open up Sonar's step sequencer view and drag and drop the pattern into that. One really cool thing about this is the step sequencer will ask me if I want to preserve the pattern's original timing or if I want it to lock everything to the grid. But editing someone else's MIDI track is not why I'm here. So I'm going to get rid of these patterns which I've added to the project and get started on making my own drum track with the step sequencer. This is where the fun begins. Every soft synth you open in Sonar, including Session Drummer 3, has a load step sequencer icon in the top right corner of its interface. Clicking that will open a new step sequencer pattern, which will float by default, but I can click in the top left corner of it and enable tabbing. The step sequencer is a pattern grid of rows and steps, which automatically maps out to any soft synth, including Session Drummer. You can preview a sound by mouse clicking on the row's name. The length of a step sequencer pattern can be any number of beats, and I'm going to make this pattern 8 beats long. Each beat can have any number of steps, so you can fit the pattern to an odd time signature, like 3/4, 6/4, 9/8, whatever you may be working on. I'll keep this in 4/4 for now, though. Inserting notes is pretty self-explanatory. Left mouse click on a step to insert a note, right-click on a step to erase it. Left-click and drag to paint notes, right-click and drag to paint erase. And if you hold Control while you paint notes, it'll tie those notes together, which is great for creating bass lines. To speed things up for my hi-hat track, I'm going to use the auto-populate feature. I'll right-click on the hi-hat row's name and choose Fill Every 2 steps. Now I'm going to preview the pattern, and because Step Sequencer locks to Sonar's tempo, I can change it on the fly. Now I'm going to add a snare pattern. And I'll add a kick drum to the pattern. Now I've got a basic kick, snare, and hi-hat pattern, but the velocity and timing are the same on every step. So I'm going to open up my hi-hat row by clicking on the square next to the row's name, and I'll edit the velocity on the upbeats of my hi-hat. And of course, different velocities trigger different samples in Session Drummer, so it sounds much more realistic. Now I want to edit the timing of the entire snare row to give it a laid-back feel. To do that, I'll grab my time offset knob, tweak that to around 7, and you can hear it sitting behind the hi-hat, or turn the time offset knob to the left to give the snare an early feel. Now it's time to add swing to the pattern. For that, I'm going to head down to my kick row and up the swing to about 63. Nice, now I've got a little groove going, but I'm not satisfied yet. I'm going to adjust the per step time offset of my kick drum to push some of these notes even farther back in the pocket. And of course, you can right-click to erase the CC data and then just put it back in as needed. Now this pattern's really starting to groove, so it's time to add a snare roll and some ghost notes. To create the snare roll, I'll add 2 snare hits at the end of the pattern. Then I'll double-click them to flam the hits. I'll open up the snare row and adjust the flam amount so that the flam hits are spread farther apart. Next, I'll tweak the velocity, and I've got what sounds like a pretty convincing snare roll. Now I'm going to add some ghost notes before the downbeats. And of course, I'll tweak the velocity. Next, I need to make these ghost notes groove like the kick drum. So what I'll do is adjust the time offset of just the ghost notes. This kind of groove manipulation is really what you'd find in classic hardware sampling drum machines. But I don't have to connect and sync a hardware device because the step sequencer patterns live in my track view just like every other audio and MIDI clip. So I'll move my clip to measure 1 and repeat it for 16 bars. And I'm going to create a loop point from the selection. Now I'm set up and ready to work in the track view, but what if I want to go back and edit my step sequencer pattern? Let's say maybe sometime after the step sequencer view is closed. It's so easy. All you have to do is double-click the step sequencer clip, and it will automatically open up the pattern in the step sequencer editor. Now I'm going to show you my personal secret weapon for arranging drums in Sonar, which is the track layers feature. First, I'll right-click in the track separator and click on Show Layers. I'll right-click there again, this time choosing to insert a layer. And now I have 2 layers in one MIDI track. It's kind of like having 2 tracks in one, and it's awesome for arrangement. Now I'm going to fit content to resize the contents of the clip so I can better see it down the road. You're probably wondering what exactly I'm going to use this second layer for, and the answer to that question is a crash cymbal. So I'll create a new step sequencer pattern. I'm going to click the Insert Row icon to add the crash row and drop a crash cymbal right on the one. Now I'll drag my newly formed cymbal pattern to the second row, and instead of rolling it out and repeating it, I'm going to copy and paste it so that it hits on every other repetition of our main pattern. Now I'm going to create a change up or a break in the pattern, something like a middle 8. So I'll insert a third row, and I think I'll have this pattern start at measure 9. I'll create another step sequencer clip and insert new rows. This pattern's going to be a ride cymbal pattern. There's my ride bell and my ride cymbal. I'll make this pattern 8 beats, and I'll auto-populate the ride cymbal every 2 steps, just like we did with the hi-hat. I'm going to throw in some ride bells, say every 4 steps here. And I'll throw in some grace notes too on the ride cymbal pattern. I'm also going to adjust the velocity. Tweak those just a little bit. And I'll add some swing to the entire row. To arrange my rides, I'll drag the pattern down to the 3rd row and roll it out to repeat it 2 times. Typically, hi-hats and ride cymbals don't play at the same time, so I need to fix that. I'm going to slip edit the end of my main clip, bring that into measure 9, and copy and paste it over to create a second clip. Copied step sequencer clips are linked by default, so when I make a change in this clip, it gets reflected in that clip. Because I want my new clip to be a unique variation, I'm going to right-click on it and choose Unlink Step Sequencer Clips. Then I'll double-click on my new pattern and mute the hi-hat row. Next, I'll trim the muted hi-hat clip to match the length of the rides. And I'll copy and paste over the original clip to flesh out the rest of the pattern. Next, I'm going to add a tom-tom fill leading into the ride section and also leading out of the ride section. So I'll insert a 4th track layer and create a new step sequencer pattern. And I'll add a couple more rows so that my high tom appears. There it is. There's my mid and my low tom. And I'm going to grab the handle on the high tom row just to drag it down so it's next to the other toms. I'll throw a couple of steps in. I'll flam the first tom hit. And I want this tom fill to swing. So I'll change all 3 rows' swing amount at the same time by grabbing the handle on one row, dragging down to multi-select. And now when I adjust the swing in my high tom row, the same adjustment will take place in my other tom rows. Now that my tom fill pattern is ready, I'll drag the clip down to the 4th track lane and copy and paste it over. And I'm going to do a little slip editing on my main clip. I'll pull that in just a little bit. Then I'll hold down Control to multi-select my main clip and my rides clip to trim them simultaneously. I really can't tell you how much I love the step sequencer and the track layers for arranging drums. And now I've got this cool little groove that I can continue to flesh out and write a song around. But now we're going to skip ahead to mixing drums. So first I'll collapse my step sequencer pane, flip over to the bus tab, and again I'll hit F to fit tracks to project. Now I'm going to mix down my drums using PX64 percussion strip on every track. So I'll right-click in my kick tracks effect bin, scroll through the custom plugin menu, and there it is, PX64 percussion strip. Now I'll hold down Control and drag to copy and paste it to every effects bin of all my other tracks. PX64 percussion strip is really like having 7 effects in one because it's a channel strip designed specifically for mixing drums. It's got tube saturation on the input stage, a transient shaper, a compressor, an expander that also works as a gate, a 4-band EQ, a tempo syncable delay, and tube saturation on the output stage. On top of that, the 5 inner modules are freely routable via drag and drop. This makes the percussion strip not only really flexible, but also really easy to use. Speaking of easy to use, PX64 has a built-in help system. If you're not sure what a particular control does, click it, and the plugin will tell you what it does over in the parameter window. And this goes for every control in the plugin, so if you've ever wondered what a compressor's threshold does, now you know. Before I get mixing with the PX64, I'm going to turn on waveform preview back in the track view. First, I'll quick group my tracks. And now that they're grouped, you can click the waveform preview button in any of the tracks to turn it on for all of the tracks. Waveform preview is one of those underrated but really cool features. It's basically a pictorial representation of what the waveform would look like on an instrument track or a bus if you were to print it to audio. It'll also show you if and where you're clipping, but I set up proper gain staging in this project earlier, so I shouldn't have that problem. Now I'll solo the kick right from PX64 itself, and I'll get to work right away on the transient shaper. You can use it to increase the attack or add punch to a sound. Or you can do the opposite and give a sound a softer attack. You can also affect the decays, meaning you can basically add or subtract room tone from a sound. You can also affect the color of the transients. This one's for the decay, and this one's for the attack. And the weight control will give you a fatter or a thinner sound based on how the color is set. Next, I'm going to dial in some compression. PX64's compressor is really easy to use. As you can see, it's only got 2 knobs, threshold and ratio. So all you have to do is set your ratio, and then turn the threshold to the right for less compression, and turn it to the left for more compression. Attack, release, knee, and makeup gain are all going on under the hood. Now I'm going to go down to my expander and use it as a gate. So to make it a gate, turn the ratio all the way to the right. You can hear the difference already. A lot of that room tone and ring is gone. Here it is before, and here it is gated. Now I want to add some EQ, but I'm going to drag and drop it so that it's at the end of the signal path. The first thing I'll do is grab my high pass filter, set it to around 8K, and turn it down by about 6 dB or so, just to kill those ultra high frequencies. Now I'll grab my low mid band, and I'm going to try a vintage curve and sweep around a bit, maybe for some low mid offending frequencies. Actually, I'll change it to classic to narrow the Q a little bit. That sounds pretty nasty. I think I'll turn that down by 3 or 4 dB. Now I'm going to add a little low end. I'll grab my low shelf filter, set it to around 70 Hertz, and boost it by a couple dB. And do a little A/B comparison. This is before PX64, and with PX64 turned on. But I still hear a resonant ring that I want to get rid of. Now the PX64's EQ is more of a broad stroke brush, great for adding color and changing timbre. So for a surgical job like this, I'm going to use the Sonitis EQ. This is a 6-band, fully parametric EQ. Each band can be either a bell curve, a high pass or a low pass filter, or a high or low shelf. So I'll grab one of my bell curves. I'm going to narrow down the Q a bit first, then turn up the gain and search for the resonant frequency. Sounds about right there. I think I'll tighten up the Q a little more and kill that frequency. So check it out before the EQ and with the EQ. Now I'll right-click in the effects bin to bypass all the effects on our kick track. And now unbypassed with the PX64 and Sonitis EQ back on. Now it's time to work on my snare drum. So I'll open up its percussion strip, solo the track, again from the plugin, and I'll drag the transient shaper to the front of the signal path. The transient shaper's decay can add a ton of room tone, or it can make it disappear. Now the color control on the transient's decay really brings out the sizzle in the snares, or you can pull them back. And you can do the same thing with the transient's attack. I'm going to go for a slightly darker attack with a crisper finish. Now I'm going to EQ the snare. So first, I'll change the low band to a high pass filter and set the frequency to about 120 Hertz, just to get rid of any low end rumble. Next, I'll grab the low mid band and just do a quick search for some low frequency garble. Sounds like it about there, so I'll cut that by a few dB. And now I'm going to grab my high mid band to find the sweet spot. Maybe I'll change that to a vintage curve for a wider Q. And that sounds about right, so I think I'll give that a little boost. And I'll grab my high band, cut that by a few dB, and set that to about 10K or so. Now, just like with the kick, I hear an offensive resonant ring in my snare. So I'm going to insert the Sonitis EQ here as well. Again, I'll grab one of my bell curves up the Q, pull up the gain, and search for the frequency that really stands out when you boost it. Like that, right about there, right around 710 Hertz. That sounds horrible. Then you want to narrow your Q a little bit, get a little more precise. Just pull it right out of the mix. Next, I'll add a little compression to the snare drum. I want to do some light compression, so I'll set the ratio to about 1.5. And again, turn the threshold to the left for more compression, and turn it to the right for less compression. That sounds about right. So check out the snare without the PX64 and Sonitis EQ, and with the two plugins. Now that I've got the snare and kick sounding how I want, I'm going to bring the kick back into the mix to check the level of the two tracks relative to each other. Awesome, I'm happy with that so far. So now it's time to mix the hi-hat. I don't like to do a whole lot to my hi-hat, but I do like to add a little tube saturation to the input stage. So I'll crank the tube saturation, turn up the input trim, then turn down the output gain to adjust for that. And this should warm it up just a little bit. Now I'll grab the EQ, change the low band to a high pass filter, and set it to around 150 Hertz, again, to kill any low frequency rumble that might be there. Now I'll grab the EQ's high band, set it to around 10K, and give it just about a dB or so of boost. Next, I'll grab the high mid band, set it to around 4K. I'll change the curve to vintage and cut it by a few dB so it doesn't overlap with the snare's sweet spot. And again, I'm going to insert the Sonitis EQ because just like with the kick and the snare, I hear an offending resonant frequency in the hi-hat. I'll narrow the Q on one of the bells, turn up the gain, and sweep around. So there's the resonance. I'll narrow the Q, dial it in, and kill the gain on that frequency. Here's a quick before and after. All right, it's sounding better, but I still hear another resonant frequency, so I'm gonna grab another of the bell curves. That sounds like it right there. So I'll kill that frequency and give you another before and after. And here's a before and after of both the PX64 and Sonitis EQ. So let's bring the snare and the kick back into the mix and check the level of the hi-hat. I'm going to turn that down a little bit. Sounds like it's sitting right in the pocket, right there. Now it's time to mix the toms, so I'll close out the hi-hats EQ and percussion strip. And I'm also going to create a loop point around the tom fill by selecting the clip and clicking Set Loop Points to Selection. And open up the toms percussion strip. Check out what the transient shaper can do on a tom-tom. You can totally add tons of room, or you can make it disappear. And the color controls can do cool things on tom-toms also. Next, I'm going to use the expander as a gate. First, I'll drag the transient shaper to the front of the path and put the expander right behind it. Now I've just got to find that sweet spot in the threshold for that perfect amount of decay. Next, I'll add a little EQ. I'll change the low band to a high-pass filter, set it to around 60 Hertz so the low tom doesn't fight with the kick drum. Check out the tom-toms before PX64 and after PX64. They go from sounding like being in a gigantic room to a tight studio recording room. Now I'm going to check the level of the toms compared to the rest of the drums. They sound a little loud, so I'll turn them down a few dB. And finally, it's time to add the cymbals to the mix. So I'll unsolo my other tracks, solo the cymbal, close down the tom-toms PX64, and redo my loop point. Now I'll open up the cymbals PX64 and get started on the EQ. So I'll make the low band a high-pass filter, set it to around 160 Hertz or so, and I want to add a little sizzle. So I'll set the high shelf to around 10K and boost that by a couple of dB. I think I'll grab the low mid band and kill some of the low mid mud. Set that to around 500 or so and cut that by a few dB. And here's how the cymbals sound in the mix. I think I'll turn those down a few dB. Sounds about right. Now I want to A/B my entire mix, wet versus dry. So I'll right-click in an effects bin and choose bypass bins of this type to bypass all track effects bins simultaneously. So here's my dry mix. And here's my wet mix. Again, the dry mix. And the wet mix. Quite a difference between wet and dry, but I'm not done yet. Now I'm going to add a little bus compression to the drums. So I'll insert a PX64 onto the drum bus. Before I get compressing, I want to show you what the transient shaper can do on an overall drum kit. This can be really cool on a drum bus or on a drum loop, where all the sounds are on one track. Can totally suck the room right out of a drum loop. Or you can add weight for a fatter sound. Or pull the weight back for a tighter drum sound. Now I'm going to turn that off because I just wanted to show you what that sounds like. So for some light bus compression, I'll turn the ratio to about 1.4. And I'll crank the threshold all the way down and slowly dial it back to find just the right amount of compression. So let's do an A/B. Before bus compression and after bus compression. So there you have it, a complete drum part, created, arranged, and mixed all within SONAR.